Just minutes ago, FBI and ICE confirm a massive coordinated raid has dismantled a trucking network, leading to dozens of arrests and the seizure of cash and weapons.
Today, we dismantled what we believe to be the most sophisticated criminal trucking network ever discovered on American soil. This was not a cartel operating from the shadows. This was a cartel operating in plain sight, wearing the uniform of American commerce. Those words came from the podium of a joint federal press conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at exactly 2:47 p.m. Central Time. Behind the speaker stood representatives from the FBI, ICE, DEA, and the Department of Homeland Security. Their faces were stone. Their silence said everything. 83 arrests. $95 million in seized cash. Over 400 illegal weapons recovered. 17 tractor trailers impounded. And buried inside the data servers of what appeared to be a legitimate freight logistics company, federal investigators discovered something far worse than drugs or money. They discovered a blueprint. A blueprint for transforming the American heartland into a permanent smuggling superhighway, connecting the southern border to Canada, with Minneapolis as the operational nerve center. This is the story of how it happened. This is the story of how they got caught. And I promise you, the deeper we go, the darker it gets. 4:17 a.m. Minneapolis, Minnesota. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees. Fog rolled low across the industrial freight yards near the Mississippi River, where rows of 18-wheelers sat dormant in the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the frozen landscape. The city was asleep. But the federal government was not. Over 200 agents had been staging in position since midnight. FBI tactical units. ICE Homeland Security investigations teams. DEA strike squads. SWAT operators from 3 different jurisdictions. They had spent 11 months building this case. 11 months of surveillance. 11 months of intercepted communications. 11 months of watching a criminal empire grow under the protection of people who were supposed to stop it. Tonight, that empire would fall. At exactly 4:19 a.m., the first breach team hit the main logistics hub of Northern Star Freight Solutions, a trucking company headquartered in a sprawling warehouse complex on the city's industrial east side. Flashbang grenades shattered windows. Armored agents poured through loading bay doors. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the frozen air like thunder. Inside, workers scrambled. Some tried to run. Others dropped to their knees with their hands raised. But the agents weren't there for the drivers. They were there for the office. On the second floor of the warehouse, behind a steel-reinforced door disguised as a maintenance closet, federal agents discovered something that would change the scope of the entire investigation. A hidden command center. 12 computer terminals. Encrypted satellite communication equipment. And a wall-mounted map of the continental United States covered in red and blue lines, tracing routes from Laredo, Texas, all the way to Winnipeg, Canada. This was not a trucking company. This was a continental smuggling network. Simultaneously, strike teams hit 14 other locations across the Twin Cities metro area. A halal grocery store in Cedar Riverside that served as a cash collection point. A used car dealership in Brooklyn Park that laundered money through fake vehicle sales. A construction company in Burnsville that employed undocumented workers as mules. A real estate office in Edina that purchased properties to warehouse contraband. By 5:45 a.m., the raids had produced 47 arrests and the seizure of over $31 million in cash, bundled and vacuum-sealed in black duffel bags hidden inside false walls, underground storage containers, and modified truck compartments. But the money was only the beginning. Inside a climate-controlled storage unit attached to the Northern Star warehouse, agents discovered 1,200 pounds of methamphetamine, 400 pounds of cocaine, 80,000 fentanyl pills, and 14 crates of military-grade weapons, including AR-15 rifles, body armor, and night vision equipment. One agent, a 20-year veteran of the DEA, stood in that storage unit and said 5 words into his radio: "This is bigger than Minneapolis." He was right. 9:22 a.m. FBI Cyber Forensics Division. Chicago Field Office. The encrypted hard drives recovered from the Northern Star Command Center arrived under armed escort. Within 3 hours, federal analysts had begun the painstaking process of cracking the security protocols. What they found would keep them awake for the next 72 hours. The network had a name. Internally, the organization referred to itself as the Corridor. And the Corridor was not a local operation. Shell company after shell company appeared on the analyst screens. Ghost corporations registered in Wyoming, Delaware, and Nevada. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Dubai, and Singapore. fake non-profit foundations claiming to support refugee resettlement, restaurant franchises that existed only on paper, agricultural export firms that never shipped a single bushel of grain. The money flowed in circles designed to confuse. A wire transfer from a freight invoice in Minneapolis would bounce to a holding company in Phoenix, then to a real estate trust in Miami, then to an investment fund in London, before finally landing in a numbered account in Zurich. The entire cycle took less than 48 hours. And it happened dozens of times per month. But the analysts weren't just following money. They were following people. Deep inside the encrypted files, federal investigators discovered a series of authorization codes. Digital signatures that approved major shipments, large cash transfers, and the acquisition of new routes. Every significant decision in the corridor required approval from a single source. That source was listed only by a code name, the administrator. It took 17 hours of cross-referencing financial records, property deeds, campaign contributions, and encrypted communications before the analysts made the connection. The administrator was Marcus Denton Webb. And Marcus Denton Webb was the Deputy Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Transportation. For 7 years, Webb had overseen the state's freight and logistics infrastructure. He controlled the approval of trucking permits. He managed the scheduling of way station inspections. He had direct influence over which routes received priority maintenance and which routes were quietly neglected. And according to the evidence now spreading across federal computer screens, Webb had used that position to build the corridor into one of the most efficient smuggling networks in American history. Every major shipment had his digital fingerprint. Every route expansion required his authorization. Every time a way station mysteriously closed for equipment maintenance during a convoy scheduled passage, Webb's office had signed the work order. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. And the operation was about to get much, much larger. The next morning, 5 a.m. Federal Emergency Operations Center, Minneapolis. The room was the size of a basketball court. Dozens of federal agents sat at computer terminals arranged in concentric semicircles, all facing a massive digital display that covered the entire front wall. On that display was a map of the central United States, from the Texas border to the Canadian frontier. Red markers pulsed across the screen. 63 of them. Each one represented a confirmed corridor asset that had been identified through the seized servers and financial records. Trucking depots in Kansas City. Warehouse facilities in Omaha. Distribution centers in Sioux Falls. Transfer points in Des Moines. Cash houses in Fargo. And stretching south like a crimson river, a chain of waypoints that connected Minneapolis to the Mexican border through Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. The corridor wasn't just moving drugs north. It was moving people. Human trafficking victims. Migrants smuggled across the border for fees ranging from $8,000 to $15,000 per person. Workers forced into indentured servitude at construction sites, meatpacking plants, and agricultural operations across the Midwest. Women and girls trafficked into underground prostitution networks operating behind the facades of massage parlors and nail salons. The scope was staggering. Federal analysts estimated that the corridor had moved over 12,000 people through its network in the past 3 years alone. And the profits from human smuggling had been reinvested into drug trafficking infrastructure, creating a self-sustaining criminal ecosystem that grew stronger with every successful shipment. At 5:15 a.m., the operation commander addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, what you are looking at is the largest coordinated takedown in the history of Heartland law enforcement. In the next 6 hours, we will execute simultaneous raids across 7 states. We will deploy over 800 federal agents, supported by state and local law enforcement partners. We will have Black Hawk helicopters providing aerial surveillance and rapid response capability. We will have Coast Guard vessels patrolling the Mississippi River corridor. And we will have United States Marshals standing by to process what we expect to be the largest single-day arrest operation in Midwest history. He paused. The target is the corridor. The objective is total dismantlement. No one gets away. No one gets a warning. We move fast, we move hard, and we move together. Questions? There were none. At 5:47 a.m., the operation began. In Kansas City, DEA strike teams hit a meatpacking plant where corridor operatives had been using refrigerated trucks to transport cocaine hidden inside beef shipments. 22 arrests. 800 pounds of cocaine seized. In Omaha, FBI tactical units raided a used car auction facility that had been laundering money through fraudulent vehicle titles. 14 arrests. $9 million in cash recovered. In Sioux Falls, ICE agents descended on a construction company that had been employing trafficked workers at below minimum wages while skimming their earnings to fund corridor operations. 19 arrests. 47 trafficking victims liberated. In Des Moines, SWAT teams breached a residential compound where corridor enforcers had been storing weapons and conducting counter-surveillance on federal investigators. 11 arrests. 86 firearms seized, including 2 fully automatic weapons. In Fargo, joint federal and state units hit a network of check-cashing stores that had been processing millions of dollars in structured transactions designed to avoid banking regulations. 8 arrests. $12 million in cash and money orders confiscated. And in Minneapolis, as the sun rose over the frozen city, federal agents arrived at the home of Marcus Denton Webb. The deputy commissioner was arrested in his driveway at 6:34 a.m., still wearing his bathrobe. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply stared at the badge held before his face with the expression of a man who had always known this moment would come. By noon, the operation had produced 83 total arrests across 7 states. $95 million in cash and assets had been seized. Over 2 tons of narcotics had been recovered. And the digital infrastructure of the corridor had been captured, catalogued, and rendered permanently inoperable. The underworld had taken more damage in 6 hours than it had in the previous 6 years. But the investigation was not over. Inside a secure federal facility in downtown Minneapolis, FBI analysts began the process of examining the most sensitive materials recovered from the corridor's command center. And what they found painted a picture of corruption so deep it shook veteran investigators to their core. The corridor had not merely bribed individual officers. It had built a parallel enforcement structure within Minnesota law enforcement. Over 40 state and local officials had been receiving regular payments from corridor accounts. Patrol sergeants who adjusted their routes to avoid interception of smuggling convoys. Dispatchers who delayed response times to locations where corridor business was being conducted. Evidence technicians who lost or contaminated samples connected to corridor operations. And at least 3 judges who had consistently issued lenient sentences for corridor-connected defendants. The payments were sophisticated. They came through shell companies disguised as consulting fees, campaign contributions, and real estate commissions. Some officers had been receiving supplemental income for years without ever knowing the true source. But others had known exactly what they were doing. Internal communications recovered from the seized servers revealed a network of at least 12 officers who had actively coordinated with corridor leadership. They had provided advance warning of planned raids. They had shared intelligence about federal investigations. They had facilitated the identification and neutralization of informants. One email, sent from a burner account linked to a Minneapolis police sergeant, read simply, "Package clear. Route 94 secure through 0400. Confirm receipt." The sergeant had been paid $4,000 for that single message. Federal agents arrested him at his precinct the following morning. He had 19 years on the force. He had a commendation for bravery. He had a family photo on his desk. And he had sold his badge for the price of a used car. The honest officers who remained felt the betrayal like a physical wound. Men and women who had risked their lives believing they were part of something noble now understood that some of their own colleagues had been working for the enemy all along. One detective, interviewed after the arrests, said something that would stay with investigators for years. "I thought I knew who we were fighting. Turns out, some of them were standing right next to me." The badge would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. But the corridor's ambitions had extended far beyond Minnesota. As analysts continued their examination of the seized data, they discovered that Marcus Denton Webb had not been operating alone. He had been part of a coordinated network of compromised officials stretching across multiple states, each one controlling a critical piece of infrastructure that the corridor needed to function. A Port Authority official in Texas who ensured that certain shipping containers were never inspected. A Highway Department supervisor in Oklahoma who scheduled road closures that coincidentally cleared paths for smuggling convoys. A trucking commissioner in Nebraska who approved operating licenses for corridor shell companies without conducting background checks. A border liaison in New Mexico who facilitated communication between corridor operatives and their contacts south of the border. The corridor had not infiltrated the system. It had redesigned the system. And at the center of the redesign was a document that federal analysts discovered on Webb's personal hard drive. A strategic plan titled Continental Integration Phase 3. The document outlined the corridor's 5-year vision for transforming the central United States into a permanent smuggling superhighway. It detailed plans for acquiring additional trucking companies, establishing new distribution hubs, corrupting additional officials, and eventually creating a shadow logistics network so deeply embedded in legitimate commerce that it would become functionally impossible to dismantle. The plan estimated that upon full implementation, the corridor would be capable of moving over 50 tons of narcotics per month from the Mexican border to Canadian distribution points, with minimal risk of interdiction. It projected annual revenues exceeding $2 billion. And it included contingency plans for eliminating federal witnesses, bribing jurors, and compromising prosecutors. The final page of the document contained a single sentence, written in Webb's own hand: "The system does not need to be defeated. It only needs to be redirected." This was not a criminal organization. This was an attempted takeover. In the days that followed, the full scope of the corridor's human cost became impossible to ignore. Federal investigators identified over 300 victims who had been trafficked through the network over the past 5 years. Women from Central America who had been promised legitimate jobs and instead found themselves trapped in forced labor. Teenagers from East Africa who had been smuggled into the country and sold to criminal enterprises. Families who had paid their life savings for passage north, only to discover that their journey ended in servitude rather than freedom. The fentanyl that had flowed through the corridor's routes had left its own trail of destruction. Overdose deaths across the Midwest had increased 43% over the past 3 years. Entire communities had been hollowed out by addiction. Emergency rooms had been overwhelmed. Morgues had run out of space. Each pill that passed through the corridor's network represented a potential death. Each shipment that reached its destination meant more families destroyed, more futures erased, more lives reduced to statistics in a coroner's report. And the man who had made it all possible had been a respected public servant. He had attended charity galas. He had spoken at community events. He had shaken hands with governors and senators. He had worn the mask of legitimacy while building an empire of suffering. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it only needs silence and ambition, and the willingness to look away while others pay the price. The prosecution of Marcus Denton Webb and his co-conspirators would take years. The evidence against them filled thousands of boxes. The witness list included hundreds of names. The legal proceedings would become one of the most complex criminal cases in Minnesota history. But the arrests sent a message that echoed far beyond the courtroom. The message was this: no network is too sophisticated to be dismantled. No corruption is too deep to be exposed. No criminal enterprise can operate forever in the shadows, no matter how many badges it buys or how many officials it compromises. The men and women who took down the corridor did so because they believed that the system, despite its flaws, was worth defending. They believed that justice, however imperfect, was better than surrender. They believed that the badge meant something, and that meaning was worth fighting for. They still believe that. And they want you to believe it too. If you're still here, if you watch this entire story, then you understand why it matters. You understand that the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than most people want to admit. You understand that the price of freedom includes eternal vigilance. Tap like so more people can see this story. Comment expose if you want these kinds of investigations dragged into the light. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's really happening in the American heartland. And remember, this story is fictional. It was created for educational and entertainment purposes only. But the issues it explores, the corruption, the trafficking, the smuggling, the human cost of organized crime, those issues are painfully, undeniably real. The corridor was fiction. But the fight against what it represents continues every single day. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. And never forget that the truth, no matter how dark, is always worth knowing.